Warframe is very weird. Hello everybody, it's me, Sci-Fi. I'm back again with another video today. Now this one is going to be very different from what I've done before, and that is I'm going to be reviewing an entire mechanic today. And that mechanic is one that most people don't talk about, which we'll do in a moment, and that is Punch Through. Now Punch Through is a mechanic in Warframe that is generally disregarded, and it's not because it's a useless mechanic. By the evidence I'll show you soon, it's actually quite an important one. But it's mostly because it involves having to play into more steps in order to kill enemies, so to speak. Like with AoE weapons, for example, you just have high range on the explosion, say some slash ticks or heat damage, and you're good to go. Whereas with Punch Through, it's a mechanic that allows for projectiles to pass through enemies and hit more enemies before it expires. However, as a downside, you generally need to get enemies lined up or bundle them together to make Punch Through work as intended. Because on especially the newer tile sets, it's harder and harder to get enemies to line up so you can allow the Punch Through to do its job. Now when it comes to Punch Through, generally 0.6 meters of Punch Through is needed in order for a single projectile to pass through an enemy. And because of this, the general rule is 1 meter of punch through equals an additional enemy can be hit by the projectile that you are firing. Now that's all well and good, but as I mentioned before, AoE weapons are much easier to play around with than punch through weapons. So, how would you use this? Well, you see, punch through is a mechanic that has a lot to the eye, and that is because of how it behaves with certain weapons. You see, some weapons have what would be called on-contact explosion mechanics, so to speak, where when the projectile hits an enemy, they cause an explosion dealing extra damage in a small AoE, or even a large one, depending on what kind of weapon it is. Now, this doesn't work all the time. For example, on weapons like the Brumna, if the bolts slash shots go through the enemy and hit another one, they will generate an extra explosion on the punch-through hit. However, on other weapons like the Comorex, it will literally just pass through all the enemies and will only explode when it hits a wall. And this is entirely because of the way the weapon is coded, meaning that some weapons will get the mechanic of the Trumnet, some won't. It is entirely based on random chance. And this also extends to some other weapons too, like the Shadow, where it straight up won't get punched through at all, even if you give it punch through. Meaning that it is a complete waste to use it on those types of weapons. However, there is one other class of weapon that really takes advantage of punch through to the extreme, and that is beam weapons. Most specifically, ones with chain attacks. Now, with regular beam weapons, and especially ones like the Convectrix or the Phage that I reviewed before, they are beam weapons where they typically will only be able to hit one target at a time, but if you give them punch through, the weapon's beam will go through the enemy and hit the enemy behind them as well, much like regular projectile weapons. But because of this, beam weapons can take that crazy amount of status chance and crit damage and apply it to all enemies behind them, allowing you to kill enemies way, way faster than you would with killing them one at a time. One of the biggest reasons why the weapons like the Phantasma are so crazy strong is not just because the status chance and the multi-shot of the weapon is pretty high, it's also because it has full body punch through by default, making it very easy to clear entire rooms with these weapons, even if you have only a couple of enemies lined up to be able to get hit by the beams. However, things get even more silly with the chain attack weapons like I mentioned before. So the way these weapons work is that on hit, the beam will split off and chain into other beams that will hit more enemies. These ones having decreased damage from the main beam can branch off between 3 to 5 beams depending on the weapon. But in the case of punch through, if given to these weapons, not only will the main beam travel through the enemy, but the punch-through enemy or enemies will also create more chains, meaning that on these weapons such as the Amprex, Tenet Cycron, Kuvanukor, etc., you can get anywhere from 3 beams up to 5 or 9 or more, depending on how many the weapon has by default, significantly boosting your DPS and allowing these weapons to go from all-right weapons to absolute crowd clearers because of a single stat. Now, with all this in mind, because I've talked about AoE earlier and with how punch through works with certain weapons, does it justify using punch through over AoE? Well, it depends. You see, if you don't want to worry about things like your ammo economy and want to try out other ways of dealing DPS without having a big explosion, punch through is kind of the better option here, because it allows you to hit more than one enemy, while also getting decent DPS and not having to worry about running out of ammo, because ever since the ammo nerfs that happened about a year or so ago, using AoE weapons, especially big staples like the Kuva Brahma, are not really the best option nowadays, unless you want to invest heavily into ammo economy. But if you want to use it with, say, beam weapons, most specifically the chain attack ones, in this case it might even be better than using AoE, because not only do these weapons typically have much more ammo, but they also can generate more SAS effects and more damage over time effects than AoE. And this is an excellent segue into the best mod for this, and that is Prime Shred. Now, as you know, I've been teasing this a little bit throughout the video and in some forum posts before, but Prime Shred is the best option if you want to utilize Punch Through. Only because at max rank it has 2.2 meters of punch through that can be given to any weapon, but it also gives additional fire rates. And the reason why this is important is because fire rate boosts the number of effective pellets that you are discharging from your weapon when hitting an enemy, meaning that you can not only hit even more enemies because of the punch through, but you'll have even more instances of damage because of the increased fire rate. And this is further boosted within beam weapons, which boosts the number of damage checks that the beams do. It is overall an excellent mod, and if you decide to invest in the punch through, this is the #1 mod I can recommend if you decide to get into it. But anyway, that's been me, Sci-Fi, talking about punch through, a very underrated stat in my personal opinion. And I hope to see you guys out there using this more often, or if you don't, at least know that this knowledge exists. Have a wonderful day. See you all next time.